There is a silent movement happening in the world. You may have felt it, that sudden urge to disappear for a while, to log off, to step away from empty conversations, to no longer belong to the same places. It isn't escape, it's exhaustion. It is the body saying it can no longer bear the noise of the collective. It is the soul asking for silence so it can breathe. Carl Jung called this the necessary withdrawal, the moment when the awakened being realizes that continuing to participate in the collective unconscious requires a betrayal of oneself. There is a pain only those who have awakened know. The pain of seeing what others do not see, perceiving the shadow in gestures, the masks in words, the lie within normalcy, and yet still smiling, pretending, participating, until the body begins to react. Awakening stops being a pretty idea and becomes a biological crisis of the soul. The world remains asleep, but something in you is already awake, and there is no way to fall back asleep. That is why so many are disappearing quietly, not in anger, but in lucidity. Not because they reject the world, but because love of truth has become stronger than the desire to belong. Jung said that those who awaken do not withdraw from the world out of arrogance, but out of psychic necessity. When consciousness expands, prolonged contact with collective unconsciousness becomes toxic. Thus, the disappearance of the awakened is not an abandonment of humanity. It is the first act of caring for it. Because before offering light to the world, you must preserve it within yourself. If you feel this need to vanish, you may not be losing yourself. You may simply be coming home. Chapter 1. The Awakening that Breaks the Mirror. Spiritual awakening rarely begins with light. It begins with fracture. Something inside us cracks, like a mirror that can no longer reflect a false image. Suddenly we realize that much of what we called I was merely the reflection of someone else's gaze, a set of roles, expectations, and masks inherited from the collective. And when consciousness touches this truth, there is no return. Jung said the process of individuation is the slow collapse of the persona, the social mask we learn to wear in order to be accepted. While we are spiritually asleep, that mask protects us, but upon awakening, it begins to suffocate us. The air of the world feels too heavy, the roles no longer fit, conversations sound like repeated scripts. It is like living in a theater where everyone keeps acting, but you already know the plot and the falseness of the lines. At first, this creates confusion. You try to become who you were, but something in you no longer fits. The old clothing of the ego is too tight. What once made sense now sounds hollow. Victories that once brought pleasure now feel purposeless. And what once hurt now echoes differently, as if asking for understanding, not repression. The mirror of the collective breaks and the reflection dissolves. This is where many believe they are losing themselves, when in truth they are simply freeing themselves from the image they never were. The false self takes its leave. And that goodbye hurts, because it is a symbolic death. Consciousness finds itself before emptiness, nothingness, silence. But in that emptiness, the true self begins to emerge. Jung called this the dark night of individuation. The soul, seeing itself naked, experiences loneliness and fear. But this loneliness is sacred. It is the womb of inner rebirth. The awakened one begins to understand that they are not moving away from others, but moving closer to what is real. And the real, at first contact, is almost unbearable, because it dismantles all the illusions that held up the old world. That is why many awakened people feel strange, out of place, misunderstood. It is not social rejection, it is vibrational incompatibility. While the collective still dances to the rhythm of unconsciousness, the awakened one hears another sound, coming from the depths of the soul, and that sound calls. It calls inward, to silence, to reconstruction. Awakening, therefore, is not about ascending, but about descending, descending into the deepest layers of the soul, where the real self awaits recognition. Breaking the mirror is not destroying the world. It is freeing yourself from the lie that kept it intact. And the price of truth is always the same: temporary solitude, but eternal authenticity. Chapter 2. The Pain of Incompatibility. There is a point on the path of consciousness when the simple act of being in the world begins to hurt. Not a physical pain, but something subtler, like a dissonant vibration between who you are and what the world insists on being. Superficial conversations become unbearable. Places that once felt welcoming now exude fatigue. Even the body seems to protest in environments saturated with noise and haste. Carl Jung observed this in himself and in many of his patients. He called this state psychic incompatibility, when the awakened being becomes unable to fully participate in the collective unconscious without getting sick. It is not arrogance nor spiritual elitism. It is the biology of the soul. When consciousness expands, it becomes sensitive to vibrations that previously went unnoticed. The lie in words, the tension in gestures, the despair hidden behind success. The awakened mind sees what lies beneath appearances, and seeing hurts. It hurts to realize that much human suffering is self-imposed, that many live inner wars disguised as normalcy. It hurts to feel the weight of the collective unconscious, where each person projects their shadow onto another and calls it justice. And it hurts even more to pretend not to see, just to keep belonging. Jung said, "What is not made conscious returns as fate." Therefore, the awakened one, by staying in unconscious environments, feels as if their very body were being drained. It is a kind of exhaustion that does not come from too many tasks, but from the constant effort to keep a light on in a room full of sleep. Staying awake among the sleeping is like trying to breathe underwater. So the soul begins to withdraw, first into silence, then into distance. Interactions become brief, selective, essential. There is a weariness that asks for retreat, not because the other is an enemy, but because being together requires denying your own vibration. The awakened one realizes, to keep existing here, I have to pretend to sleep. And pretending is what kills the soul. The pain of incompatibility is the harbinger of transformation. It indicates that the frequency has changed, that the old environment no longer holds the new being who has been born. Just as the butterfly cannot remain in the cocoon, the awakened soul must leave the spaces that once felt like home. But the way out is not escape. It is loyalty to your own growth. From this point on, the call to withdraw begins to sound, and the awakened one understands it is not about disappearing from the world, but about turning inward. It is the beginning of the hermit's journey, the one who chooses silence not as isolation, but as vibrational healing. Chapter 3. The Call to Withdraw, when silence becomes medicine. There is an almost inaudible instant when the soul touches my shoulder from within. It doesn't arrive as a decree, it arrives like a breeze. Step back a little. Remember your own sound. It is in that whisper that withdrawal stops being an idea and becomes medicine. Jung saw this movement as an act of self-preservation of consciousness, when staying exposed to collective noise begins to dilute the self. Silence heals not by absence, but by density. To withdraw is not to disappear from love. It is to remove the projections that confuse love with performance. It is to pause the compulsion to be seen so that finally you can see yourself. At this stage, the psyche asks for edges, boundaries not erected against the world, but in favor of what has been born within me. Like the hermit of the tales, I turn to the inner lantern. I no longer walk blindly. I choose the step. I choose the rhythm. I choose what crosses my psychic field. Jung described the archetype of the hermit as a phase of symbolic incubation. Just as seeds need the fertile shade of the soil, nascent consciousness needs silence to integrate what, if exposed too soon, would become just another spiritual persona. Withdrawal offers three medicines: effective decompression, where the heart lays down old guard, one's own rhythm, replacing collective haste with the timing of the soul, reordering of the senses in which inner truth leads again. And it is not escape. Escape is running from what hurts. Withdrawal is sitting beside the pain and asking what it needs. There are days when the body asks for forest, water, sky. On others, it is enough to close your eyes for 10 minutes and take your hands off the steering wheel of the mind. The criterion is vibrational honesty. What truly nourishes me? What merely distracts me? Try cultivating silence for a few minutes a day, a moment that is yours alone. Pause, deep breathing, full attention. As the days pass, silence creates ballast. I notice I belong less to the settings and more to the inner axis. I speak less. I feel more. I seek less approval. I offer more truth. The world does not change. I change the way I offer myself to it. And solitude ceases to be a desert and becomes a fertile cloister where the self lights its symbols. When the call to withdraw comes, let it be simple. Fewer screens, more sky, less noise, more body, fewer opinions, more presence. This is how consciousness learns to breathe on its own again. If you feel this conversation could serve someone you love, send the video, leave a like, and subscribe to follow upcoming topics on individuation and the hermit's path. Chapter 4. The Tower of Bollingen, symbol of the authentic soul. When Carl Jung built his tower on the shores of Lake Zurich, he did not raise merely a house. He raised a mirror of the soul. Every stone carried an intention, every wall a reminder of the crossing that had stripped him of all masks. He called that place Bollingen, and there he lived the quietest and most fertile years of his life. It was not exile, it was return. It was not loneliness, it was integration. Bollingen was the visible symbol of something invisible, the inner tower every awakened being needs to build. The tower represented the axis between the human and the divine, a space where time slows and the soul breathes without witnesses. Jung wrote and carved archaic symbols into the stones, not as decoration, but as a reminder that the unconscious speaks in images, and that when we grow quiet, it answers. There, without clock or routine, he returned to the original language of the soul, the sound of wood burning, of water touching the shore, of his own thoughts dissolving. It was a retreat, yes, but a retreat within the world, not outside it, a space where the psyche could be real, without persona, without audience, without performance. Each of us carries the seed of that inner tower. Some build it in nature, others within a simple room, others still in the silence before sleep. What matters is not the place, but the gesture, to erect a space where the true self can exist without witnesses. In that space, consciousness no longer needs to prove its own worth. There is no applause, no expectation. The tower is the opposite of the stage. Jung said, "Only in isolation can I be what I am without the interference of others." But that solitude is not a turning away from human love. It is preparation to love more broadly. In the inner tower, the ego dissolves, and the self emerges, vast and silent, like the lake that surrounded Bollingen. Today, our tower need not be made of stone. It can be built from small rituals, a cup of coffee sipped in silence at dawn, a notebook where we write without censorship, a daily moment to listen to ourselves without hurry. These simple gestures are spiritual bricks. They outline the invisible tower that protects the authenticity of being. To live awake in a world that prizes spectacle is an act of courage. And that courage needs shelter. The tower is that shelter, the place where consciousness rests after crossing the crowd. It is the space where we remember we do not need to display ourselves in order to exist. There, between silence and flame, the soul reunites with the essential. And whoever finds that place within themselves is never truly alone again. Chapter 5. The weight of light, the fatigue of consciousness. Little is said about the tiredness that comes with awakening. Everyone exalts the light, but almost no one mentions its weight. To be conscious is to carry a sensitivity that does not switch off. It is to perceive what lies behind each look, what vibrates in the silence between words, what cries out for healing amid someone else's laughter. And that constant perception, that invisible listening, wears you down. Jung called this phenomenon invisible psychological work, the effort the awakened person makes to keep their consciousness intact in unconscious environments. While the world lives anesthetized, the awakened one feels everything. Feels the anger thick in the air, the hurry of those who have lost themselves, the neediness disguised as power. To be lucid is to walk among pains others have not yet named, and no matter how evolved it may seem, it is profoundly exhausting. There are days when the body asks for a pause, not out of laziness, but out of energetic saturation, as if every cell had heard too much, felt too much, absorbed too much. Jung observed that his most conscious patients fell ill not due to moral failure or weakness, but from excess lucidity without shelter. Consciousness, when maintained amid the collective unconscious, consumes vital energy, just as a flame uses its own oxygen to illuminate. This is the paradox of light. The stronger it becomes, the more shadow it reveals, and seeing shadows without being able to transform them is one of the quietest sufferings of the awakened soul. That is why many feel called to withdraw, not as escape, but as vibrational recharge. The body asks for solitude, the way a musician needs silence after hours of concert. Silence becomes the only nourishment capable of restoring the spirit. It is in this pause that the soul reorganizes. The noise dissipates, the heart returns to its own rhythm, and the body rediscovers the frequency of the sacred. The fatigue of consciousness is, in truth, a reminder. It is not about carrying the world, but about lighting your own path. We are not here to save everyone, but to avoid losing ourselves while loving what is human. The modern world glorifies doing, but awakening invites being, and being requires space, rest, presence. Therefore, the true spiritual seeker learns to stop, to close the eyes not to isolate, but to align. Pause becomes prayer, silence, medicine, and fatigue, a call to return to center. Chapter 6. The Return of the Invisibles. After the long crossing through silence, something begins to change. There is no fanfare, no epiphany. There is only a slight internal shift, as if the heart were saying, "Now I can return, but in a different way." The awakened being understands they no longer need to flee the world, because they no longer belong to the same world as before. They return, but not to participate. They return to serve. They no longer seek recognition. They seek resonance. They no longer need to prove anything. They simply live their truth quietly. Carl Jung observed this cycle as a natural part of individuation. After the hermit phase, the mature individual returns to the collective, but no longer identifies with it. They become what Jung called a border dweller. One who lives at the margins between the individual and the collective, the visible and the invisible, present but not absorbed, close but not confused. The world still touches them, but no longer captures them. The invisibles are those who return. They live discreetly, often anonymously. They are artists who create works that heal, therapists who listen with the soul, teachers who teach what the system forgot. They do not speak on behalf of the ego, they speak on behalf of experience. They do not sell light, they share what they earned in the dark. The return of the invisibles is quiet, yet powerful. They do not try to change the world by force, but by vibration. Their simple presence creates fissures in the collective unconscious. Where there was noise, they bring calm. Where there was haste, they emanate pause. They are like points of resonance in a chaotic field, and whoever comes near feels it. Jung said that, after integrating the shadow, the human being gains a new form of responsibility, to sustain consciousness amid unconsciousness without succumbing to it. That is the mission of the invisibles. They know you cannot wake those who still need to sleep, but you can keep a candle lit for when they choose to awaken. This is the new form of spiritual presence. It is not to evangelize, but to embody, not to convince, but to vibrate, not to teach, but to remind. The return of the invisibles marks the beginning of a new phase of collective consciousness, a stage in which quiet example outweighs rhetoric and inner coherence replaces the need for external approval. They are those who walk among us, and though few notice them, hold the invisible thread that prevents the total collapse of the world's soul. Conclusion: disappearing to become real. Disappearing was never the end. It is simply the way the soul restores itself. Just as the moon needs the dark to recover its own shine, consciousness needs silence to remember what it is. The disappearance of the awakened is not giving up. It is transmutation. They do not vanish from the world. They dissolve at the margins, where life still breathes with truth. Carl Jung said individuation does not make us superior but whole, and that is why true awakening is not loud, it is humble. The awakened soul does not want to convince, it wants to understand. It does not want to save, it wants to serve. And sometimes serving is withdrawing so that your very presence is not contaminated by the noise of the collective. There is something sacred in disappearing, not the disappearing of despair, but the conscious disappearing, the one that says, I need to withdraw in order to remain true. It is in this quiet gesture that consciousness regenerates, the self strengthens, and love matures. Awakening, therefore, is a spiral. First the call, then the breaking, the silence, the integration, and finally, the return. But the return is not to the same place. It is to a broader, calmer, more real state. Those who disappear consciously return different. They return whole. If today you feel like stepping away, do not fight it. Perhaps life is simply inviting you to become real, for the soul does not vanish. It merely changes frequency, and at that new frequency, all that is false dissolves, and all that is true finally begins to blossom. Share in the comments. What have you discovered about yourself in your moments of disappearance? Like, subscribe to Inner Sanctuary and continue this journey of depth, presence, and consciousness.